Welcome to the debate. Today we're focusing on an economic outcome that's being driven by a technological reality, arriving much, much faster than I think most models are predicting. We're looking specifically at the deployment of physical AI technologies. And this is starting right now with autonomous robotaxis in Austin, Texas. But the critical marker, the one referenced in the source material, is this expectation of mass production for these systems starting in 2026. This isn't some gradual curve. This is a signal of an imminent tipping point.
And the material projects that this wave, within a few short years, will first just obliterate the transportation industry and then be followed almost immediately by the commercialization of, generalized AI like Optimus. So you get this disappearance of human labor across factories, jobs, even homes.
Right, the scope is terrifyingly comprehensive. It's not suggesting displacement. It suggests, as you said, eradication of labor from the three pillars of the modern economy. It sets up this sudden global cascade.
Exactly.
And this speed, this sheer breadth of displacement, it forces us to confront an inescapable economic conclusion. So here's our central question. Does the rapid, large-scale technological replacement of labor inevitably guarantee that the economic value of generalized human labor will converge to absolute zero? And if it does this then mandate the immediate adoption of individual capital ownership? We're talking stocks, equity, in the means of production as the only viable defense against income loss for the average person. I'm going to argue that the answer to both is a resounding yes. Zero labor value is inevitable, and capital ownership becomes the essential, immediate response.
And while I absolutely respect the gravity of what the material is indicating, this displacement across jobs, factories, and homes is clear. I have to challenge the inevitability of an absolute zero convergence for all labor value. And beyond that, I fundamentally question the structural viability and the practical efficacy of relying solely on individual stock ownership as some kind of universal solution to what is a systemic and epochal shift. The proposed remedy, I think, might create more fragility than it solves.
Well, my position is really rooted in the progression that's laid out in the material. The timeline, 2026, mass production of automated physical AI, which then leads quickly to Optimus commercialization. It just changes the math of human participation in the economy overnight. I mean, once physical AI can perform labor at scale and with efficiency, and mass production implies that scale, the marginal cost of that labor just approaches zero. If the supply of productive labor becomes nearly infinite and effectively free, costing only energy and maintenance, then human labor, which is finite and demands a subjective reward, it's priced out of the market completely. Economic value is derived from scarcity. So if labor ceases to be a scarce resource, its market value vanishes. This isn't philosophy, it's just basic supply-side economics. The only logical mechanism for securing a basic income, as the material suggests, has to be securing ownership, stocks in the companies that possess these new, scarce means of production. Because the traditional wage contract, that's just not going to be an option anymore.
And while that is, I grant you, the most mathematically clean interpretation, the leap to complete zero value for all human input, I think that's an oversimplification, even within the context of the material. We agree the scope of displacement is enormous, but economic value might just relocate. It might not disappear entirely. The material says the concept of economics will change, which is, different from claiming value will just cease to exist. The speed of change is sufficient for massive job displacement, certainly, but is it really sufficient for the collapse of all the economic concepts that underpin our complex modern economies? The new economy may still place a tremendous value on non-automated inputs. We have to consider the high-level intellectual labor, creative design, the complexity management of these sprawling AI systems, regulatory compliance, system optimization, and crucially, I just have to challenge the viability of the solution itself.
Owning stock is, in theory, sound, but relying on this for an entire global population that's facing zero income, it ignores the structural problems of accessibility, inherent market volatility, and just the astronomical scale of distribution required for individual stock portfolios to reliably replace universal wages.
Okay, let's push on that, on the totality of the displacement, because the market mechanisms themselves imply a convergence to zero faster than I think you're allowing. We have to distinguish between, say, the tiny fraction of intellectual elite labor and the vast majority of generalized labor. The mass production of automated physical AI, it fundamentally breaks the supply curve for the three sectors described. If the material state's labor disappears across transport, factories, and homes, we're talking about, 90% of the working population? For them, the market mechanism guarantees their value approaches zero.
But the material specifies the mechanism of displacement, which I think is key here. Robotaxis. They're relatively simpler systems designed for specific logistical tasks. So yes, we can see their labor value hitting near zero very fast, maybe within that 2 to 3 year window after 2026. That's a huge economic blow, but Optimus is different. It's generalized physical labor. Its deployment in factories and homes implies interaction with chaotic, non-standardized environments. And the initial economic value there doesn't just reside in the robot doing the work. It resides in the intellectual labor that designed the system, the continuous AI training, the complex sensor management, and, the bespoke non-replicable oversight you'd need to prevent catastrophic failures in those chaotic environments.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on that timeline for intellectual scarcity. You're relying on highly specialized labor remaining scarce, but the material describes this displacement happening within a few short years. If physical AI development is accelerating this fast, how long until AI itself is designing the next generation of AI? The moment these systems become sufficiently managed their own complexity to write their own optimization code, which is the goal of true generalized AI, that specialized intellectual value you're relying on, it begins its own swift, inescapable decline towards zero as well. The scarcity you're pointing to, it shifts from human intellectual capital to machine IP ownership very quickly.
That shifts the entire risk calculus, absolutely. But let's just pause on that acceleration. Even if AI can design AI, the regulatory framework, the legal liabilities, the necessary physical maintenance of a global fleet of billions of Optimus units, that remains a non-automated input for a significant transition period. If even 1% of the total labor value remains locked in highly complex management and design, preventing that absolute convergence to zero, it fundamentally changes the nature of the basic income solution we'd need. We're talking about whether the labor market becomes 99% worthless or 100% worthless. And that 1% difference tied to highly skilled intellectual labor is where the remaining capital accumulation happens, to where the human political system might try to intervene to redistribute wealth, rather than rely purely on this individual mandate of stock ownership.
But the problem is, we're discussing a solution for the masses who need a basic income. For the vast majority, the generalized labor, their value is zero. And we can't base a survival strategy on the hypothetical continued scarcity of a tiny intellectual elite. The material says labor disappears, and that disappearance is what drives the economic shift. If I can get perfect 24/7 service for the price of electricity and depreciation, the market simply has no rational basis to pay a human.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered this leads us right into the second core point, the scope of changing economic concepts? You argue for a total collapse of the existing model because the wage consumption loop breaks. If production becomes effectively zero cost, then yes, traditional scarcity for material goods breaks down. But foundational concepts like ownership, distribution, consumption, they have to persist in some altered form. So what exactly does the material mean by the change? Is it simply a change in the wealth distribution mechanism, or is it that the very concept of value vanishes?
I don't buy it. If labor value is zero, then the primary mechanism by which the vast majority of consumers earn the capital to consume those now free goods, it collapses. Wage-based consumption, taxation models, they cease to function. This isn't a recession, it's a fundamental failure of the engine of demand. If demand collapses, what is the point of infinite free production? That interdependence, it necessitates an entirely new paradigm for wealth distribution and value creation. The material is explicit. The concept of economics will change.
I agree that traditional demand curve disappears, but we have to consider what replaces it. If goods are free, value shifts to manufactured scarcity, to access, or to non-material goods. You might see the system restructure itself around attention or status, bespoke experiences, services that require human curation, things that AIs can't fully replicate, or at least not in a way that confers status. we may still need an economy to manage access to limited resources like premium real estate or unique IP rights. If value is measured by access and exclusivity rather than production cost, that structure persists.
That seems like wishful thinking, though. It's predicated on the continued viability of the financial system that supports that kind of luxury consumption. If the foundational concepts that rely on labor scarcity are obsolete and 90% of the population has no reliable income stream, who is left to sustain that luxury market? The only remaining source of income is capital ownership, so the concept that must fundamentally change is the one linking human effort to human reward. If human reward is decoupled from effort, it must be coupled to ownership. Any attempt to preserve a scarcity model based on luxury fails because the mass consumer base that's necessary to maintain the whole financial architecture has been impoverished. The change has to address the source of income first.
And you keep bringing it back to that singular source of income, ownership, which leads us to the third point, because this proposed solution, individual stock ownership, it presumes the continued stability of the very financialized system it's trying to leverage for survival.
Well, the material specifies that owning shares in the companies that own these means of production is the only individual solution specified to secure basic income. This assumes that capital ownership, specifically equity or stock, becomes the sole reliable source of income in a post-labor economy. And why stock? Because it grants ownership of the IP and the productive machinery itself. It represents residual profits and control over the new scarce asset, the automated means of production. It's the only defense mentioned against complete income collapse.
I come at it from a different way. I counter the practicality of that individual mandate. For this mechanism to replace wages universally, it requires a level of economic stability and accessible capital that might be fundamentally impossible to sustain when labor, the very foundation of consumer spending, has been eliminated. Let's look at the systemic risk. If every individual must secure their basic income via stocks, we are transferring income risk from wages, which historically are relatively stable, to inherently volatile equity markets. We're effectively asking a displaced assembly line worker or taxi driver to become a full-time, high-stakes portfolio manager just to eat.
The alternative is zero income. The choice is binary in this scenario.
But the solution creates a fatal dependency. If the entire global population's survival is tied to the stock performance of a handful of companies, the new masters of production, who absorbs the risk if one of those companies fails, or if the market has a systemic crash? I mean, imagine a catastrophic failure of a large optimist deployment. The resulting market correction could wipe out the basic income of billions of people simultaneously. We're setting up a highly centralized, incredibly fragile distribution system. And furthermore, how can the stock market even sustain its valuation if there's no stable, wage-earning consumer base left to support the valuation of the goods these companies produce?
The value of the stock may no longer be tied to traditional consumer spending, though. It could be tied to the ability of the company to perpetually generate near-free goods, creating enormous internal efficiencies, maybe supplying governments or centralized distribution systems. The value is in the production capability itself, not necessarily in the transactional exchange with wage-earning consumers who no longer exist.
That implies a complete re-architecting of market valuation, which is a massive leap. Let me just give you a quick thought experiment. For this to work, we're asking a truck driver who earns, say, $70,000 a year to suddenly manage a portfolio equivalent to what? $500,000 if we assume a safe 4% withdrawal rate? In a market that has lost its fundamental consumer base? That's not a transition. That's a forced, high-stakes gamble on a radically unstable financial system. So while I grant the intellectual consistency, that ownership is the only game left, the material is discussing reality, not just philosophy. And consistency means nothing if the proposed solution guarantees systemic economic failure because of the total absence of consumer demand.
The material forces us into this corner. The technology dictates the economics. If the machine produces goods for near free, the value shifts entirely to the ownership of the machine. The practical challenges you bring up, market volatility, accessibility, those are logistical issues that have to be addressed by distribution, maybe through nationalizing the equity or creating universal capital trusts. But they don't negate the primary economic reality. Capital ownership is the only source of non-labor income left. The individual must become a passive owner of production means to survive. absent massive systemic interventions that are not detailed in the material.
The material is brilliant because it forces us to confront that harsh choice between individual survival and systemic fragility.
So to summarize my position, the technological reality that's laid out, 2026 robotaxis, comprehensive optimist commercialization, that dictates the immediate economic outcome, and that is that the value of generalized human labor converges to zero because its scarcity vanishes. Individual adaptation, therefore, requires aligning personal income streams directly with capital ownership of the production means. It's the only non-labor-based source of basic income in this new paradigm.
And I'll summarize the counterpoint. While automation fueled by physical AI is real and rapid, the complete convergence of all labor value to absolute zero remains debatable, especially concerning complex oversight and intellectual design labor. And crucially, relying solely on individual stock ownership as a universal replacement for wages ignores the logistical scale, the enormous systemic fragility, and the catastrophic risk transfer that this places onto an entire displaced workforce, making it an impractical and, I would say, dangerous solution when implemented across society.
Regardless of our disagreements on the absolute endpoint of labor value or what the perfect solution might be, it is clear that the transition fueled by physical AI presents an unprecedented challenge to every established economic concept we have.
Indeed, the material effectively compels us to confront this question of individual survival when labor loses its market value. The economic future demands that we explore this tension between the technological inevitability of zero-value labor and the social impossibility of relying on an inherently unstable individual capital mechanism for basic survival. There remains much more to explore in the material concerning the precise nature of the economic change it anticipates.